Once upon a time, in a kingdom called Grimm, an old king lay on his deathbed. He was Hansel and Gretel's grandfather, but he didn't know that, for neither Hansel nor Gretel had been born yet. Now hold on a minute. I know what you're thinking. You are thinking, I'm well aware that nobody wants to hear a story that happens before the main characters show up. Stories like that are boring, because they all end the same way. The main characters showing up, right? But this story is like no story you've ever heard. Really.
They end up getting their head cut off.
You see, Hansel and Gretel just don't show up at the end of this story. They show up, and then they get their heads cut off. Just thought you'd like to know. Don't worry, they'll be okay. The old king knew he was soon to pass from this world, and so he called to him his oldest and most faithful servant. The servant's name was Johannes, but he had served the king's father, and his father's father, and his father's father's father so loyally that all called him Faithful Johannes. Johannes tottered in on bowed legs, heaving his crooked back step by step and leering with his one good eye. His long nose sniffed the air. His mouth puckered around two rotten teeth. But when he came within view, the old king smiled and said, "Ah, Johannes," and drew him near. The king's voice was weak as he said, "I am soon to die. But before I go, you must promise me two things. First, promise that you will be as faithful to my young son as you have been to me." Without hesitation, Johannes promised. The old king went on. "Second, promise that you will show him his entire inheritance, the castles, the treasures, all this fine land, except for one room. Do not show him the room with the portrait of the golden princess. For if he sees the portrait, he will fall madly in love with her, and I fear it will cost him his life." The king gripped Johannes' hand. "Promise me." Again, Johannes promised. Then the wrinkles of worry left the king's brow, and he closed his eyes and breathed his last. Soon the prince was crowned as the new king, and they began exploring every inch of the castle. The treasure crypts, the towers, every single room, that is, save one. One room remained locked no matter how many times they passed it. Well, the young king was no fool. He noticed this, and so he asked, "Why is it, Johannes, that you show me every room in the palace, but never this room?" Johannes squinted his one good eye and curled up his puckered two-toothed mouth. Then he said, "Your father asked me not to show you that room, Your Highness. He feared it might cost you your life." I'm sorry, I need to stop for a moment.
Why?
I don't know what you're thinking right now, but when I first read this part of the story, I thought, what, is he crazy? I mean, maybe you know something about young people and maybe you don't. I, having been one myself once upon a time, know a few things about them. One thing I know is that if you don't want one to do something, like go into a room with a portrait of an unbearably beautiful princess, saying, "It might cost you your life," is about the worst thing that you can possibly say, right? Because then that's all the young person's going to want to do, right? I mean, why didn't he say something else? Like, "It's a broom closet." Why? You want to see a broom closet? Or, "It's a fake door, silly, for decoration." Or even, "It's the ladies' bathroom, Your Majesty. Best not go poking your head in there." Any of those would have been perfectly sufficient as far as I can tell. But he didn't say any of those things. If he had, none of the horrible, bloody events to follow would ever have happened. "Cost me my life," the young king proclaimed with a toss of his head. "Nonsense!" He insisted he be led into the room. No, you ready? Okay. "Cost me my life," the young king proclaimed with a toss of his head. "Nonsense!" He insisted he be led into the room. First he demanded, but Johannes refused. Then he commanded. Still Johannes refused. Then he threw himself on the floor and had a fit, which was very unbecoming for a young man of the king's age. Finally, faithful Johannes realized there was little he could do. So, wrinkling his old, malformed face into a wince, he unlocked and opened the door. The king burst into the room. He found himself staring face to face with the most beautiful portrait of the most beautiful woman he had ever seen in his life. Her hair looked like it was spun from pure gold thread. Her eyes flashed like the ocean on a sunny day. And yet, around her lips, there was a hint of sadness, of loneliness. young king took one look at her and fainted dead away. Later in his room, he came to. Johannes hovered over his bed. "Who was that radiant creature?" the king said. "That, your majesty, is the golden princess," Johannes answered. "She's the most beautiful woman in the world," the king said. And Johannes answered, "Yes, she is. And yet she looked almost sad. Why is that?" Johannes breathed a deep breath and replied, "Because, young king, she is cursed. Every time she has tried to marry her husband has died, and it is said that a fate worse than death is destined for her children, if ever she should have any. She lives in a black marble palace topped with a golden roof all by herself, and as you can imagine, she is terribly lonely and terribly sad." The young king sat straight up in his bed and grabbed the front of faithful Johannes' tunic. And though he stared into the old man's face, he saw only the princess's ocean-bright eyes, and her lips ringed with sadness. "I must have her," he said. "I will marry her. I will save her." "You may not survive," the king, Johannes said. "I will survive if you help me. If you are faithful to me, you'll do it." Johannes feared for the young king's life. They had been faithful to the young king's father, and his father's father, and his father's father's father before that. What could he say? Johannes sighed. "I'll do it." Okay, I've got to skip a few pages so we get right to the very most exciting part. If you want any of those pages, you've got to read it yourself. We don't have time for the whole chapter, unfortunately.